North Carolina's path towards privatization. Over the last decade and a half, the public education system in North Carolina has gone through a massive transformation. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into the key policy shifts that have put the state on a very clear path toward privatization. So where are we getting all of this from? Public Schools First NC has compiled a detailed timeline that lays out all of the key changes that tell a very specific story about where public education in the state is headed. So the big question in the timeline tries to answer is, how did all this happen? How has North Carolina's public school system been so completely reshaped since 2011? The timeline shows that it didn't happen by chance. It was through a specific series of interconnected policies that created a brand new landscape. You really have to look at the year 2011 as being the big turning point. This is when a new legislative majority came in and started making some really transformative and controversial changes to education in the state. So let's take a look at what happened in those first critical years. First up, 2011. The 100-school cap on charter schools was completely lifted, which just threw the doors wide open for them to expand. Then, just a year later, the state education budget got slashed by $800 million. And by 2013, we see the A and F school grading system come in. The formula used in the grading system has been slammed for relying so heavily on test scores. So all of those early moves really set the table for one of the biggest changes of all: the huge growth of school choice programs, especially the private school vouchers and charter schools. So let's talk about vouchers. The state's voucher legislation passed in 2013, and the state's largest program kicked off back in 2014. The way it was presented to the public was a lifeline. It was really a targeted way to help kids from low-income families get out of public schools that were considered to be failing. And it started out with a pretty small budget, all things considered, just $10.8 million in taxpayer money. But you're going to want to remember that number. Okay, fast forward a decade to 2023. Well, things looked really different. In 2023, new laws made these vouchers universal. I mean, all the old rules about family income or whether you'd been to a public school before, gone. Wiped away completely. So you're probably wondering, what does that do to the price tag? Well, to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about, the report projects that by 2034, the yearly cost of taxpayers for this universal voucher program could be close to $1 billion. And it wasn't just vouchers. There were also new laws that basically hit the gas on charter school growth. These rules allowed counties to use local property tax money for charters. They also streamlined the whole approval process, even getting rid of the rule that you had to think about what impact a new charter school would have on the local public school. So while all this was happening with charter schools and private school vouchers, something else was going on in parallel, and it had everything to do with the teachers in public schools. The whole professional landscape for them was shifting big time. And wow, there really was a dramatic shift here. Back in the early 2000s, North Carolina was actually doing pretty well on teacher pay, ranked as high as 19th in the country. But by 2014, that ranking had tanked all the way down to 46th. And check this out. This slide shows a really interesting detail from the state's teacher salary schedule. See that stretch from 15 to 24 years of experience? A teacher's salary just stops growing. It's fixed. This is a huge problem for keeping experienced teachers in the classroom. And that's not all. There were a bunch of other policy changes that affected teachers. Things like getting rid of extra pay for having a master's degree or for years of service. A big one was getting rid of career status and due process rights. And what was the result? Well, it led to a pretty staggering statistic. Enrollment in the state's teacher education programs dropped by over 30% in 10 years. Okay, so we've talked about charters, vouchers, and the changing world for teachers. But what about the traditional public schools themselves? How did this all affect them? Now, you can't really talk about school funding in North Carolina without talking about something called the Leandro Plan. Basically, after a huge long run of court cases, the courts ordered the state to develop this big plan to make sure that every kid gets a sound basic education that the state constitution promises them. But actually funding that plan was still a huge point of debate. After over 30 years in the courts, the North Carolina Supreme Court dismissed the case, a huge blow to North Carolina's public schools. This highlights a conflict in budget priorities. On one hand, you see voucher funding shoot up by 129% in just a 2-year span. But on the other hand, since 2008, state budget cuts mean losing 7,000 assistant teacher positions in public schools. The timeline also highlights some other things that put more pressure on public schools. For instance, the state put new limits on K-3 class sizes, but didn't provide money for the extra classrooms that you'd need. And now parents' rights legislation added a whole lot of work for public school teachers by requiring them to post all their lesson plans online. So after all is said and done, after this decade and a half of big changes, where does North Carolina stand today? Well, North Carolina ranks 43rd for average teacher salary and 48th for spending per student. The state is even worse for overall funding level and education funding effort, which is how much of the state's economic muscle goes to education. North Carolina is at number 50, dead last for funding effort and 50th for funding level. What is the state going to do to change the future of public education in North Carolina?